Disclaimer: the following program is designed to offend, provoke, and challenge your religious sensibilities. It contains content that will likely offend anyone who holds religion sacred. This is for those with thick skin or a taste for the harsh truth. If you're easily offended or cherish your religious views, please turn off now. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. You have been warned. Recently, Wes Huff made some bold claims about the transmission of the Bible, suggesting that it was reliably copied from the original manuscripts to modern translations without any major errors or distortions. But does history support that? Let's take a closer look at the actual evidence and see whether this is solid scholarship or just another case of apologetics rewriting history. Before we dive in, if you enjoy fact-checking bad arguments, debunking religious myths, and exposing apologetic nonsense, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment on what claim you want me to dismantle next. And hey, if you think Wes Huff actually got something right, let me know. I'd love to hear it. Now let's take apart this claim about biblical transmission piece by piece. And let's just kick it right off. The very first thing said is this.
We just heard about artifacts that confirm the Old Testament, and now we're going to be talking about the New Testament.
This is a classic bait and switch. He starts with the assumption that there are artifacts that confirm the Old Testament without actually presenting any. What artifacts? What specific archaeological finds prove that, say, the Exodus happened or that Moses was a real person? There aren't any. The closest they get are inscriptions that might reference some biblical figures, but nothing confirming the grand narratives. Instead of addressing that, he immediately pivots to the New Testament.
The Old Testament was a story in search of a conclusion.
This is theological, not historical. He's trying to frame the Old Testament as an incomplete story that had to be fulfilled by Jesus. That's not history, that's Christian doctrine. Jewish tradition, for example, doesn't see their scriptures as incomplete. This idea only exists because Christianity needed to justify why their Messiah was a no-show when it came to fulfilling actual messianic prophecies.
We do things like stick shovels in the ground, and we confirm and corroborate so many different things.
Oh, do we now? This is vague hand-waving. What exactly has been confirmed? He's trying to ride on the back of genuine archaeology without specifying any finds that confirm the New Testament's theological claims. Yes, archaeology can confirm places and some historical figures, but it does not confirm supernatural claims or the theological framework of Christianity. This opening is setting up a false narrative that archaeology and historical research consistently affirm the Bible. In reality, biblical archaeology is often an exercise in apologetics, where believers try to force ambiguous findings to align with preconceived beliefs, while ignoring evidence that contradicts them.
And he says that as Christians, we have to strive to pursue faith-seeking understanding.
He invokes Anselm, a medieval theologian who is famous for trying to justify belief in God through logic. See ontological argument, aka the idea that God must exist because we can conceive of a perfect being. Yeah, that was his big contribution. The phrase faith-seeking understanding is just another way of saying believe first, ask questions later. This is pure apologetics. Real historical inquiry doesn't start with faith. It starts with evidence and skepticism. The moment you commit to belief before investigation, you're no longer doing history, you're doing theology.
You know, it's one thing to believe the Bible, and we should, if we claim to be a Christian, believe.
Notice the quiet assumption here. Belief is the default. If you call yourself a Christian, you should believe the Bible. This is a dogmatic statement, not an academic one. He's front-loading the argument with the expectation that faith must be upheld rather than challenged. A real historian wouldn't start from, we should believe this, but from, what does the evidence actually support?
This isn't just a story, or it's no less than a story.
Here comes more bait and switch. He says the Bible isn't just a story, but then immediately admits that it is a story. He wants to have it both ways, treating it as a historical document while glossing over the fact that it's full of theological narratives, folklore, and mythology. The claim that it finds its foundation and place within actual times, events, and locations is misleading. Sure, it mentions real places, but so does Game of Thrones. But that doesn't mean Westeros is real.
Through a number of archaeological artifacts, through artifacts that we have discovered that do things like corroborate.
Now we're in the setup phase. He hasn't presented anything yet, just the promise that the evidence is coming. This is a typical rhetorical trick say you're going to present overwhelming evidence, build up confidence in the audience, and then offer ambiguous or misleading data that makes it feel like the case is stronger than it actually is.
When we open our Bibles, see the actual times and places and people come into existence.
This is half-truth at its finest. Yes, the Bible mentions real locations like Jerusalem and Rome. It even mentions historical figures like Pontius Pilate. But here's the problem. Just because a text references real places and people does not mean the supernatural claims attached to them are true. If I write a story about George Washington fighting dragons in Virginia, the presence of a real person and location doesn't make the dragon part any more factual.
Because the Bible did not exist in a vacuum, and the New Testament did not exist in a vacuum.
Of course, the New Testament didn't exist in a vacuum, but that doesn't mean it's historically reliable. Religious traditions always evolve by absorbing earlier ideas, and Christianity is no exception. The New Testament wasn't just documenting history, it was actively reshaping Jewish theology to retrofit Jesus into messianic expectations. Early Christians borrowed from Second Temple Jewish apocalypticism, Greco-Roman philosophy, and existing religious myths to construct their theology. The Gospel of John's Logos concept, that's Greek Stoicism repurposed for Jesus. Paul's epistles, they're dripping with Hellenistic rhetorical techniques and ethics. So, while it's true that Christianity was shaped by its environment, that doesn't make its claims historically accurate. Just makes it another example of how religions absorb, adapt, and mythologize over time. This first part of the video is just laying the groundwork for his main argument, that archaeology supports the New Testament. But he's already framed it dishonestly. He's conflating historical context with historical accuracy. Just because something is set in history doesn't mean it happened the way it's described. This is the same flawed reasoning people use when they say, the Iliad mentions Troy, therefore the Greek gods must be real. Nope.
The New Testament has a historical context that it stems from.
Well, no kidding. Everything ever written has a historical context. That doesn't mean it's historically reliable. The Lord of the Rings has a historical context, 20th century Europe. The Iliad has a historical context, 8th century BCE Greece. That doesn't mean Gandalf or Achilles were real people. This is a sneaky way of making it sound like simply existing within a historical framework gives the New Testament credibility.
It is thoroughly a Second Temple, first century Jewish document.
Not exactly. Parts of it are, but it's also steeped in Greco-Roman thought. Paul, the biggest contributor to the New Testament, wasn't just some run-of-the-mill Jewish rabbi. He was a Hellenized Jew writing in Greek, using Greek rhetorical techniques and incorporating ideas from Stoicism and other philosophical schools of thought. The Gospel of John, for example, is soaked in Hellenistic concepts, like the Logos, a Greek philosophical idea repurposed as Jesus. Moreover, the further we get from Paul's letters, the earliest Christian writings, the more the New Testament moves away from Second Temple Judaism and starts resembling a new Greco-Roman religious movement. So this claim is misleading. Yes, the New Testament starts in a Jewish setting, but it quickly evolves into something else.
That last section of your Bible isn't one book as much as it's a collection of 27 books written over the course of 60 years by at least 9 different authors, writing to multiple audiences in multiple places in the language of the ancient world, that being Greek at that time.
This is a subtle trick to make the New Testament sound like a collection of independent, corroborative sources, but that's not the case. The gospel writers weren't independent witnesses. Markan priority is widely accepted, meaning Matthew and Luke copied heavily from Mark rather than providing unique testimony. John, written even later, is theologically driven and departs dramatically from the synoptic accounts. The Pauline letters contradict the Gospels on key theological points. Paul emphasizes salvation by faith alone, while the Gospels emphasize deeds and adherence to the law. His eschatology assumes Jesus would return in his lifetime, while the later Gospels subtly push that timeline back. The New Testament texts also underwent revisions, edits, and outright forgeries. The longer ending of Mark, a later addition. The woman caught in adultery story in John, a later addition. Several epistles attributed to Paul and Peter, scholars widely recognize them as pseudonymous forgeries. So sure, multiple people wrote the New Testament, but many of them weren't who they claimed to be, and they weren't independent accounts of history. They were theologians reshaping Jesus into what they needed him to be.
And so, by acknowledging the historical realities of the New Testament and evaluating them on those terms, that these are historical documents. They're theological documents, but ultimately they are historical documents.
This is sneaky because he's trying to frame the New Testament primarily as a historical document while only briefly admitting that it's also theological. But the reality is the opposite. The New Testament is first and foremost a theological document written with the goal of spreading Christian doctrine. If we apply this logic elsewhere, we'd have to say the Quran or the Book of Mormon should also be treated as historical documents first and foremost. Apologists would never do that because they only play this game when defending their own sacred texts.
By evaluating them on those terms, via the evidence we're presented, it only helps us to understand, to seek that faith-seeking understanding.
I had to cut this one off. You know, fair use laws and all. Anyway, he goes on to say that realizing that even as we find ourselves 2,000 years after the most recent one was written, these ancient texts have a framework and context. So he starts with the faith-seeking understanding nonsense again. This is just a long-winded way of saying start with faith, then try to rationalize it with evidence, which again, is the exact opposite of how historical inquiry works. Also, the fact that these texts have a framework and context doesn't mean they are accurate. The Iliad has a framework and context in Bronze Age Greece. The Epic of Gilgamesh has a framework and context in ancient Mesopotamia. That doesn't mean everything in those texts actually happened. He's taking something trivial, these books exist in a historical setting, and implying that it somehow supports the idea that the events they describe are factual. This whole part of the video gives the trust the process vibe, subtly priming the audience to accept that because the New Testament was written in a historical period, it must be historically reliable. But none of this actually proves that anything in the New Testament happened. It just tries to create an illusion of credibility by emphasizing context over actual verification.
The history of the Bible is not some sort of layered web of translations.
This is a blatant attempt to dismiss a real and well-documented issue in biblical transmission. The idea that the Bible went through a telephone game of translations, Greek, Latin, English, etc., is an oversimplification, but it's also not completely wrong. What he's trying to do here is make it sound like the transmission of the Bible has been perfectly straightforward, which is completely false. The reality is that while many modern translations go back to Hebrew and Greek texts, those texts themselves are not original manuscripts. They are reconstructed from copies of copies of copies, with variations, interpolations, scribal errors, and outright forgeries along the way. The idea that we just jump from the original Hebrew and Greek to modern Bibles in a single step is absurd.
In reality, what we find ourselves with is a single step, going from the original Hebrew and Greek directly into our Bibles today.
This is an outright lie. There is no single step from the original languages to modern Bibles. First, we do not have the original manuscripts of the New Testament, only later copies, the earliest of which are fragments. The vast majority of our complete New Testament manuscripts come centuries after the original texts were supposedly written. Additionally, there are significant textual variations between manuscripts, meaning scholars have to reconstruct what they think the originals said. The result? A modern Bible that is not a perfect representation of what was originally written, but rather an approximation based on thousands of manuscripts, many of which contradict each other.
The translation of the Bible takes into consideration an amazing collection of archaeological evidence, from discoveries in Israel like the Dead Sea Scrolls, to papyri dug up in places like Oxyrhynchus.
Nice sleight of hand here. He throws out archaeological evidence as if it's some magic bullet that proves the Bible's reliability. The Dead Sea Scrolls, yes, they confirm that parts of the Hebrew Bible were transmitted with some accuracy, but they also contain apocryphal and sectarian writings that were not included in the Bible, which raises an awkward question. If these scrolls represent reliable scripture, why doesn't the Christian Bible include all the texts found there? Oxyrhynchus papyri. This is a collection of thousands of ancient manuscripts, only a small fraction of which are biblical texts. Most of these are not confirming New Testament stories, but rather give us insight into how manuscripts were copied and circulated in the ancient world. More importantly, none of this evidence supports the supernatural claims of the Bible, only that some parts were transmitted accurately, which is a completely different issue.
Over time, as we've uncovered more of these fragments and manuscripts, they haven't complicated our understanding of the Bible, but clarified it.
Wrong again. The discovery of more manuscripts has absolutely complicated biblical scholarship. The more manuscripts we find, the more textual variations we discover, some of them highly significant. The famous longer ending of Mark 16, is not found in our earliest manuscripts. The story of the woman caught in adultery, John 7, not in the oldest and best manuscripts. The Trinitarian formula in 1 John 5, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, a later addition. None of these issues clarify the Bible. They reveal that it was altered over time by scribes with theological agendas.
The documents that sit behind the history of the Bible and the way that we translate them today gives us confidence in their reliability to go from the original languages into our own.
What he's doing here is conflating textual transmission with historical reliability. Sure, scholars can reconstruct what the manuscripts probably said with reasonable accuracy, but that does not mean what they say is historically true. We could recover every single word of the Iliad or the Epic of Gilgamesh with 100% accuracy, and that still wouldn't prove that Achilles or Gilgamesh were real historical figures.
Even though we're almost 2,000 years removed from the last book of the Bible that was written, as discoveries are made, we are not getting farther away from the text, but getting closer.
This is misleading. Yes, textual criticism helps us reconstruct earlier versions of the text, but that doesn't mean we are getting closer to confirming the truth of biblical events. We're only getting closer to reconstructing what later scribes copied. But this also ignores an ugly truth. The earliest copies of New Testament writings come from well after the fact. We don't have anything remotely close to an original gospel manuscript. The earliest substantial copies come more than a century after the events they describe.
This evidence confirms and gives us good reason to trust that our Bibles have been faithfully and accurately copied, and that what we have now is what the original authors wrote.
This is complete nonsense. The evidence actually shows that the New Testament went through a long process of copying, editing, and revision, that scribes made changes, some accidental, some deliberate, that entire passages were added or removed over time, that the Bible we have today is not identical to what was originally written. What he's doing here is confusing textual reconstruction with textual authenticity. The fact that scholars can approximate the earliest versions of biblical texts does not mean that those texts are historically accurate or that they weren't altered in their earliest stages. This is just pure apologetic smoke and mirrors. He makes it sound like biblical transmission was a clean, straightforward process, when in reality it was messy, full of contradictions, and subject to manipulation. He downplays the significant textual variations and scribal alterations that biblical scholars openly acknowledge. Just because we can reconstruct what the earliest copy said does not mean what they say is true. That's the fatal flaw in this entire argument.
Looking at the manuscript evidence of the Old Testament to likewise see that we have what the original authors wrote.
Oh, does it now? This is a blatant oversimplification. Let's break it down. We do not have the original manuscripts of the Old Testament. What we have are copies of copies of copies, most of them written centuries after the events they supposedly describe. The Old Testament has undergone significant editing and redaction. The documentary hypothesis, widely accepted in biblical scholarship, suggests that the Torah wasn't written by Moses, but compiled from multiple sources, JEDP, over time. The text evolved and was modified by scribes, often for theological or political reasons. The Dead Sea Scrolls, our oldest Hebrew Bible manuscripts, show variations. The scrolls confirm that different versions of biblical texts existed simultaneously, meaning the idea of a perfectly preserved original text is a myth. So, no, we do not have what the original authors wrote. We have later versions that were altered over time.
But with the New Testament, we almost have even more, primarily because we're closer to the time.
Again, this is misleading. Yes, we have more copies of New Testament manuscripts than we do for many ancient texts, but that doesn't mean they are historically reliable. More copies do not equal more truth. Also, The earliest full copies of the New Testament are from the 4th century. That's over 300 years after Jesus supposedly lived. Our earliest fragments, like P52, a piece of John, date to around 125 to 150 CE, which is still a century after Jesus. Early copies contain major discrepancies. There are over 400,000 textual variants across New Testament manuscripts, more variations than there are words in the New Testament itself. And closer to the time, not really. The earliest gospel, Mark, was written 50 years after Jesus' supposed death, long enough for legends and myths to develop. The later Gospels, Matthew, Luke, John, were written even later and contradict one another, so this argument is deceptive. Yes, we have a lot of New Testament manuscripts, but they are not early enough nor consistent enough to say we have what was originally written.
The first piece of archaeological artifacts that I want to look at are the manuscripts themselves.
Hold up, manuscripts are not archaeological evidence. This is a dishonest conflation of categories. Archaeological evidence equals physical objects, coins, inscriptions, buildings, artifacts that verify historical claims. Manuscript evidence is literary sources, which may or may not be historically accurate. Just because we have a lot of copies of a document doesn't mean its content is true. We have thousands of copies of the Iliad, but that doesn't mean Achilles and Hector were real people.
The ancient world was very prolific in terms of the Christians translated these documents very early.
This is another misleading claim. Yes, some early translations of Christian text existed, but very early is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. First, we do not have any first century translations of the New Testament. The earliest known translations, such as the Old Syriac, Latin, and Coptic, date to the late 2nd or early 3rd century. That's well over 100 years after Jesus supposedly lived, and decades after the New Testament texts were written. Second, early copying did not guarantee accuracy. We have clear evidence of textual corruption, we've already pointed out multiple times. Third, different Christian groups had different versions of biblical texts. Early Christianity was not monolithic. Competing sects, such as the Proto-Orthodox, Gnostics, and Marcionites, had their own textual traditions. This means that early transmission was not uniform or consistent. Some texts were revised to fit theological agendas, and regional variations crept in as scribes copied and recopied texts. So, while early Christians did produce translations, this does not mean the original texts were faithfully preserved. The fact that translations appeared within a century or two of the original writings does not mean those writings were copied without error, interpolation, or theological manipulation. Then he proceeds to talk about Dr. Kennedy, which I'm not even going to show. It's completely irrelevant. He's just giving a mini history lesson on writing technology to make it sound like he's saying something profound. The shift from tablets to scrolls to codices is a technological evolution, not proof of biblical reliability. Then a lame attempt at humor that I'm definitely not going to show that contributes nothing to the argument. So this part of the video contains several misrepresentations. It misleadingly suggests that manuscript evidence proves we have what the original authors wrote, ignoring the reality of textual redactions, scribal errors, and competing versions of biblical texts. It misrepresents the number of New Testament manuscripts, implying that sheer quantity guarantees reliability, while disregarding the fact that these manuscripts contain hundreds of thousands of textual variations, some of them highly significant. It also conflates manuscript evidence with archaeology, which is misleading. Archaeological evidence consists of physical artifacts that can confirm historical contexts, whereas manuscript evidence only tells us what later copies say. It does not verify the truth of their content. Finally, it cherry-picks examples of early Christian copying while ignoring the well-documented textual alterations in transmission. But in reality, biblical manuscripts show significant changes, contradictions, and theological modifications, far from a perfectly preserved or divine text.
When we look at these manuscripts, there are multiple ones that we could highlight.
Okay, so now he's going to finally talk about the manuscripts, and this sounds impressive, multiple ones that can be highlighted, but he's just cherry-picking a few manuscripts without actually addressing the larger, more inconvenient picture of textual corruption and variation. The mere existence of these manuscripts does not prove that the original text was faithfully preserved, let alone that the content is historically accurate. But let's watch and see what he comes up with.
P66 is a late 2nd, early 3rd century copy of the Gospel of John that preserves for us a near complete copy.
This is a common apologetic tactic, highlighting early manuscripts to make it seem like we have solid evidence of accurate transmission. However, the context he conveniently leaves out changes the picture significantly. P66 is not the original Gospel of John. It is a copy that dates to around 200 CE, meaning it was produced approximately 100 to 150 years after John was supposedly written, which is estimated to be around 90 to 100 CE. This means that we do not have an unbroken chain of reliable transmission from the original author, only a late copy that reflects the state of the text after a century of transmission. Even within P66, textual variations exist. Scholars have identified copying errors, omissions, and corrections, which indicate that scribes were modifying the text, whether intentionally or unintentionally. These changes show that even by this time, the Gospel of John was not being transmitted with perfect accuracy. The fact that P66 is one of the earliest nearly complete manuscripts only highlights how late our surviving evidence is. A century-long gap exists between the original composition and this copy, meaning we have no direct evidence of how the text evolved during that period. So, no, this does not prove that the Gospel of John was reliably transmitted. Instead, it demonstrates that scribes were actively making alterations, reinforcing the reality that the text was not fixed but fluid during its early transmission.
Codex Sinaiticus is arguably our first, what we would think of as a Bible, in that it had Genesis to Revelation all in one unit.
Yes, Codex Sinaiticus does date to the 4th century and is one of the earliest nearly complete copies of both the Old and New Testaments in a single volume. Here's what he fails to mention. Codex Sinaiticus was written over 300 years after Jesus supposedly lived, and at least 250 years after the New Testament texts were first composed. This means it is not an early witness to the original texts, but rather a much later copy that already reflects centuries of textual transmission, editing, and variations. This manuscript contains significant textual differences compared to later medieval Bibles, proving that the biblical text was not static but evolved over time. Among its most notable omissions, the longer ending of Mark 16 verses 9 through 20 is missing. This means that in one of our earliest complete manuscripts, the Gospel of Mark ends abruptly at 16 verse 8, with no post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. This later became a major theological issue, leading scribes to add the longer ending to harmonize Mark with other Gospels. The story of the adulterous woman, John 7 verse 53 through John 8 verse 11, is also absent. This passage, famously quoted in the King James Version, does not appear in the earliest and most reliable manuscripts, meaning it was a later addition to the Gospel of John. These variations directly contradict the idea that the Bible has been faithfully preserved without significant changes. Instead, Codex Sinaiticus proves that major interpolations, additions, and edits occurred over time, undermining claims of a perfectly transmitted text.
P1, the first page of the Gospel of Matthew, dug up from Oxyrhynchus, was the first manuscript of those near 500,000 papyri that were dug up.
Okay, but so what? P1 is just a fragment, not a full gospel, just a single page. It does not prove that the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew, or that it was reliably transmitted. Oxyrhynchus is a major manuscript site, but most of what was found there were not biblical texts. They were everyday documents, letters, and pagan writings. Again, he's making it sound like every manuscript discovery reinforces biblical accuracy, but the actual scholarship on these texts shows that the transmission process was full of alterations and inconsistencies.
GA777, a more than 1,000-year-old Gospels collection and one of our earliest illuminated manuscripts.
This is irrelevant to his argument. A 1,000-year-old manuscript is not early evidence, it's medieval, meaning it came long after the biblical text was already edited and solidified. Also, illuminated manuscripts are artistic works, not historical evidence. The presence of intricate paintings of Jesus means nothing in terms of textual accuracy. If anything, it demonstrates how later Christian tradition added visual storytelling to reinforce theological narratives. This part of the video is another classic apologetics tactic. He highlights only the manuscripts that he thinks sound impressive. He ignores the major textual variations in these manuscripts. He overlooks the fact that these are copies from much later than the original writings. He doesn't acknowledge how Codex Sinaiticus undermines later biblical editions. He throws in irrelevant details like 260 sheep and illuminated manuscripts to distract from the actual issues with biblical transmission. If he were being honest, he would acknowledge that manuscript discoveries have shown how much the Bible has changed over time, not how reliably it was preserved. Wes Huff presents biblical transmission as a smooth, reliable process. But the evidence says otherwise. The Old Testament is full of historical and textual uncertainties, the New Testament evolved through theological and cultural influences, and manuscripts show clear signs of editing, scribal errors, and outright forgeries. Far from proving a flawless transmission, the Dead Sea Scrolls and Codex Sinaiticus reveal textual variations in later editions, and the idea that archaeology confirms the Bible? Mostly misdirection. Sure, it verifies places and some historical figures, but that doesn't prove theological claims or inerrancy. So that's a wrap. If this video gets 50 likes, I'll start working on part 2, where we'll tackle even more manuscript issues and keep dismantling apologetic nonsense. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you want more.